This lecture is going to serve as an introduction to biology. Biology is simply the study of living things. There are many living things on this planet, many of which you're probably familiar with, but a lot also that you probably don't know a lot about. Living things can be divided into 6 kingdoms, and they're going to go ahead and be divided into these 6 kingdoms according to their characteristics, such that organisms with similar characteristics are going to go ahead and be placed into the same kingdom. The first kingdom is going to go ahead and be called archaea. The second kingdom is going to go ahead and be called bacteria. Both of these 2 kingdoms are going to go ahead and have bacterial organisms in them. The third kingdom is called protista, and this kingdom is going to go ahead and be composed of a lot of single-celled as well as multicellular organisms that are very diverse. The next kingdom is going to go ahead and be fungi, which you're going to be familiar with in terms of molds and yeasts and mushrooms. And finally, we're going to go ahead and have plantae and animalia, which you're going to go ahead and be most familiar with. And of course, we would be found in the kingdom Animalia. While biology is the study of life, what does it actually mean to be alive? Well, what characteristics are common to all organisms that are alive? Well, living organisms share 3 properties. Number 1, all living organisms are complex. Number 2, all living organisms have the ability to move. And number 3, organisms can respond to stimulation. But do these characteristics actually make an organism living? Are there other non-living things that share these characteristics? In terms of complexity, well, computers are extremely complex, so just being complex does not make you a living organism. What about movement? Clouds are moving, clouds are not alive, so movement is not going to go ahead and be a criterion that actually makes you living. And with regard to response to stimulation, a lot of things can respond to stimulation. If you blow on something, it's going to go ahead and move. So these characteristics above, while they apply to living organisms, are not going to go ahead and be the criteria that are used to go ahead and classify something as being living. They're truly not indicators of what it means to be living. Well, what actually are the indicators of what it means to be living? Well, what are the properties of life? All living organisms are going to share 5 basic properties. First, all living organisms are going to have some form of cellular organization. And living organisms are going to be composed of at least 1 cell. Some organisms are going to go ahead and be single-celled organisms, actually composed of only 1 cell. In this particular case, in the 2 figures that you see on the left-hand side of the screen, you're going to go ahead and see 2 different protist species. Number 1 on the left, you're going to go ahead and see a paramecium, a single-celled organism that you can see under the microscope. And number 2, you're going to go ahead and see a species of algae called Caulerpa. And while that thing looks multicellular, in fact, it is actually considered 1 single cell because all of the divisions between what would have been cells have been actually removed. And in this particular case, now to the right, we see a multicellular organism. And this multicellular organism is, of course, a tree. The second property that all living organisms share is called metabolism. Now, this is where all living organisms use energy and transfer it from one form to another. And energy is going to go ahead and power the bodies of all organisms. If you go ahead and look at this cartoon, you see this sweet little deer looking at this little flower. And the deer is thinking to itself, the glucose that this plant made from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water will sure come in handy. It's obviously going to go ahead and eat this form of food, and from it it will derive energy. And at the same time, the bear is behind it thinking, a yummy looking package of stored energy from the sun. Because energy is going to go ahead and, for most organisms, come ultimately from the sun, and again, be transformed from one form into another. The third property of life that all living organisms share is called homeostasis. This is where all living organisms maintain stable internal conditions. And the types of conditions we're talking about include temperature, salinity, acidity, nutrients, and waste. And organisms want to maintain stable internal conditions so that their body functions best. As an example, let's go ahead and consider thermoregulation, which is going to go ahead and be maintaining stable internal conditions of temperature. Now, humans have a set point, as you're probably familiar with, of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And the body is going to function such that it's going to allow the body to maintain a temperature around that particular set point. Something called negative feedback is going to go ahead and allow us to maintain physiological function within a relatively narrow range around that set point, and therefore our bodies will function best. Now, if there's divergence from that set point, receptors, temperature receptors, are going to go ahead and detect changes in temperature, regardless of whether you have increases in temperature or decreases in temperature. These receptors are going to go ahead and send that information to the brain, and the brain is going to process that information, and that information will be relayed to a part of the brain specifically called the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus will then send out information to what are called effectors, including sweat glands as well as the muscles. And these effectors are going to go ahead and function to allow the body to return to the set point of 98.6. So for instance, if you're overheated and temperature is above 98.6, you're likely going to start sweating to release heat. And at the same time, if your temperature falls below 98.6, you might start shivering. The muscles specifically will start shivering to go ahead and actually make heat. The next property that organisms share would be that of growth and reproduction. And these two figures illustrate both of these two things. Number one, on the left, you have sperm actually swimming toward an egg. And then also on the right, you see a developing embryo. The fifth and final property of life is that of heredity. This is where all living organisms possess a genetic system that is based on DNA and passed from parent to offspring. DNA is going to be the abbreviation for the chemical deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the genetic material of all living organisms on this planet. And what you should know about it is that all of the information that makes you who you are, for instance, the way you look and how your body functions, is going to go ahead and be contained in that DNA. And DNA is going to be packaged as units called genes. If you go ahead and you look to the right at the pedigree, you're going to go ahead and see parents as well as their offspring. And a pedigree is going to show you the genetic relationship between those two groups of individuals. This particular pedigree likely is showing you how a particular disease may be passed from parents to offspring. In this particular case, in a pedigree, you're going to go ahead and have individuals that are going to be displayed either as carriers, as normal individuals, or as affected individuals. Notice that the mother and father are both carriers, and they are going to go ahead and be displayed as half white and half purple in this particular case. Whereas normal people are going to go ahead and be considered all white, and those that are affected are going to be considered all purple. In this particular case, you see that the two parents have the possibility of passing on some sort of disease to their children. And you see that some of those children are going to end up being normal, some will end up being carriers themselves, and some could potentially end up being affected. Living organisms function and interact with each other at many levels. And these levels are going to be organized in a hierarchy of increasing complexity. First, we're going to go ahead and start off with the subcellular and the cellular levels of complexity. And then we're going to go ahead and increase toward the organismal level, the populational level, the community level, and the ecosystem level. Let's look at this as an example. First of all, at the subcellular level, we have basic units of matter. We have atoms of elements. For instance, the elements hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen. these atoms are going to go ahead and come together and form what are called molecules. In this particular case, these elements above are coming together to form adenine, which is a type of molecule that is going to be used to form DNA. These molecules are grouped together to form larger macromolecules or large molecules. For instance, in this example, DNA. And these macromolecules can go ahead and come together to form what are called organelles. Organelles are going to basically be like mini organs. They're going to go ahead and perform specific functions within a cell. And as an example here, we see DNA coming together to form this organelle, the nucleus. Now, various organelles are going to come together to form the cell. Here, for instance, we have an example which is a nerve cell. And the cell is extremely important. The cell is in fact the smallest level of organization that is actually considered to be alive. Remember earlier we talked about the fact that we can have living organisms that are composed of single cells. When several cells are grouped together and those cells are performing a specific function, those cells are going to go ahead and be grouped and called a tissue. And likewise, several tissues are going to go ahead and come together and perform a specific function, and they'll be referred to as organs. And likewise, several organs can be grouped together, and they can be considered an organ system because they actually have a common goal with regard to their function. When you go ahead and you group several different organ systems together, you ultimately form what is called an organism. Here as an example, we have this Canadian goose, Branta canadensis. Now, if we take that individual organism, this individual Canadian goose, Branta canadensis, and we consider the fact that probably in a given habitat, you're going to go ahead and have several individuals of the same species. All of those different individuals coming together would be considered a population. So here we have a population of Canadian geese. But if you also consider the fact that probably in a given habitat, you don't only have one species living there, but you have several different species, then you would actually have what's called a community. A community is where you have several different species of organisms living in a given area. And finally, you also have to consider the fact that in addition to the living species, you also have a lot of non-living factors. For instance, you're going to go ahead and you're going to have water, you're going to go ahead and have soil, you're going to go ahead and have air. So when you go ahead and you combine these abiotic or non-living factors with all of the different species that you have with the community, you actually have what's called an ecosystem. Now, when you go ahead and you move from one level to the next of organization, you often have what are called emergent properties, such that at each higher level, you're going to have novel properties that were not present at the simpler level of organization. And these are going to result from structural organization. As an example, for instance, consciousness. Consciousness is going to go ahead and result from the fact that we're going to be combining several different types of tissue together to form, for instance, the brain, and then actually form the nervous system. And then also, we have diverse interactions among organisms with each other and with the environment, leading to the different types of ecosystems that we see. As an example, we have plant succession. This is where plants are interacting with one another, they're competing with one another, and ultimately you're going to end up seeing the different types of plants we have in a given habitat because of their interactions with one another.